So you decided to get into photography and you got yourself a camera. Well, here are the basics and fundamentals that you'll need to know in order to get the image that you're looking for. If you're new here, I'm Donnie B and I make photo and tech related content. And I decided to start this series where we're going to start here at camera basics and we're going to end up all the way at expert level tips and tricks. And you might even learn some hidden gems along the way. If that sounds like something that you're into, do us both a favor and go ahead and hit that subscribe button. One thing to consider before we get started is no matter the camera brand you're trying to shoot with, whether it's Canon, Nikon, Sony, it doesn't matter, or whatever type of photography you're trying to pursue, all these fundamentals will apply the same. Now, I know your camera can be intimidating. That's a lot of buttons, dials, knobs. I get it. It's scary at first. You don't know what to do. You're just looking at this thing. It's a lot to deal with. Biggest thing is just use your camera. Use it every day. Use it as often as you can and get familiar with it. But today we're just going to focus on 3 things, maybe 4 in the end. So we're going to do aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and we may touch on focus modes a little bit in the end. So let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that your shutter is open and your sensor is gathering light, and it's measured in fractions of a second. So most cameras will go to 1/8,000th of a second, which is a fast shutter, all the way down to 30 seconds, which is a long exposure or dragging the shutter. Anything less than 1/25th of a second is considered long exposure. Most shots, you're going to want to start around 1/200th, 1/250th, at minimum 1/25th. See, in the beginning, I was afraid to crank my shutter. Actually, I was afraid to turn the ISO up, so I was always keeping my shutter speed low, and in turn, I was getting a lot of blurry photos. Eventually, you turn it up. So with like sports and action, in order to freeze that shutter, you're going to be high as you can. So 1/1000th of a second is what I would use as my base for doing sports photography. If I'm doing portraits, then probably 1/200th is what I'm going to be at because that's your flash sync speed. But we'll cover that in another video. Ideally, you want your shutter speed to be as high as possible without being underexposed. See, the faster the shutter speed, the less light the sensor is going to capture. The lower the shutter speed, the longer that shutter is open and the more light it's going to gather. So the way that you compensate for being underexposed with a fast shutter speed is with ISO. Now, ISO is your camera sensor's sensitivity. Think of it like the volume knob on your stereo. If you want your stereo to be louder, you turn the volume knob up. Well, if you want your image to be brighter, you'll turn the ISO up. Now, it's kind of counterintuitive because I know I said that you need to have your shutter speed as high as possible, but you also want your ISO as low as possible. And this is one thing that a lot of beginners are afraid to experiment with, or afraid to use, is to turn that ISO up so they keep their shutter speed low. But if you're using a camera that was made within the last 5 years, then it's going to handle a higher ISO no problem. When I say higher, I mean 6400 and below. Anything above 6400, you're going to start introducing noise and grain, especially when it's dark outside. So say, for example, you were shooting volleyball in an indoor gym, and it's a little bit dark, but you want your shutter speed to be fast because you want to freeze that action. Well, then you're going to have to compensate by turning up your ISO a little bit. So at 1/800th of a second, it's okay to run it up to about 3200 ISO. That's probably what you're going to need. Maybe a little more. And it's okay. Your camera can handle it, I promise. Just don't go going above 6400, especially if you're shooting a Canon. If you're shooting Sony, you can probably get on up there to around 12,800, but trust me, don't go over 6400, at least for now. Now, if you're doing outdoor portraits, then your shutter speed is going to be a lot lower, say maybe 1/320th to 1/500th, and your ISO is going to be a lot lower, say 100 or 200, depending on what lens you're using and what the aperture is. Now, aperture does 2 different things. It's sort of dual purpose. Number one is it determines the amount of light that's going to travel through your lens and hit your image sensor. So the lower the number, the bigger the aperture, the more open the lens is. The higher the number, the smaller the opening in the lens. So less light comes through with a higher aperture, but it also controls depth of field. Now, depth of field is the amount of the image that is in focus. The higher the aperture, the thinner the depth of field. You can see here how I have this tape measure stretched out, and as I change the aperture, you can see how more things get in focus. So with the low aperture, you can see there's a very small amount that's in focus. And as I turn the aperture up, more and more of that yellow tape measure comes in focus. Now, believe it or not, aperture is the most expensive element to photography. I don't make the rules, that's just how it is. The lower the aperture, the more expensive the lens is going to be. But you have two different types of lenses. You have variable aperture and fixed aperture. So take this Tamron 100 to 400, for example. This is a variable aperture lens. It's a 4.5 to 6.3. And as you zoom in and out, the aperture will change. So as you zoom out, the aperture will get higher, the opening will get smaller, less light will travel through the lens. And then you have fixed aperture lenses. And you have, like this is the RF 24 to 105. This is a f4 lens. No matter what focal length I'm at, it's always going to be at a f4. And then you have the wide aperture lenses. This is an old nifty 50, but this is a 1.8. So this is an extremely wide open aperture. It lets in a ton of light. Now, I will say, first starting out, it's okay to have a variable aperture lens. There's nothing wrong with that. But you do need to set a goal to where you will eventually buy a fixed aperture lens. It's going to be the biggest improvement to your photography that you can make, besides using your camera every day. Ideally, you want to buy something with the lowest aperture. 2.8 is a great place to be. F4s are also good for certain things like automotive photography, group shots, things like that, big wedding parties. F4 is perfect, but if you're doing portraits, like senior portraits and prom photos and things like that, then you definitely want to have a wide aperture to where you get that nice separation of your subject with that shallow depth of field. So real quick, I do want to touch on focus modes because this can be a little bit confusing, and depending on what type of photography you're doing, if you're doing action shots where people are moving a lot, or if you're doing portraits where they're just standing still, the focus mode is kind of important. So each camera brand calls it something different. If you're shooting Canon, then it's going to be one shot or servo. One shot is where when you lock on focus, then it stays focused in that spot no matter where the person moves. Now, if you switch over to servo, it's going to be where it will track. So if the person's moving around and you hold half press down or use back button autofocus, then it will continue to focus on that person as they move, or animal or car or whatever you're shooting. I think Sony calls it continuous. Not sure about Nikon, but Canon is servo and one shot. So like if you're doing sports or like automotive racing or motocross racing or something like that, you're going to want to be in continuous because it'll lock onto that subject and it will track it as you're tracking it across the track or the field or whatever. And if someone's just standing still and they're changing poses but not moving too much, then one shot is perfectly fine. And these are normally outlined. I know on Canon it's a green box for one shot and it's a blue box for servo. All right, well, that's going to do it for this one. I really do appreciate each and every one of y'all. Hopefully you found this helpful. And if you did, be sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Also, if you want to see a photo competition between me and my daughter where she had access to every piece of my equipment and I had to use an action camera and a 10-year-old cell phone, then click this video. Or if you want to learn how to be more cinematic with your action camera, you can click this video. As always, take care of yourselves. You know you deserve it. I'm Donnie B, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace. I could do this all day. I could do this all day.